The art of interactive storytelling through video games, when compared to other storytelling mediums, is relatively unexplored territory. Video games haven't been around for nearly as long as books or even films, and the technical limitations of early computers meant that games were significantly limited in how they could tell any story during their formative years. You couldn't fit the entire text of a novel or the visual information of a movie into a cartridge in the 80s or 90s, especially not alongside the information necessary to make that story meaningfully interactive, which would cause what little story was found in early video games to be given to the player as lore dumps at the start of the game, or even as supplemental materials through instruction manuals in order to save even more space. The effect of these technical limitations was that storytelling through video games wasn't taken very seriously, even for a while after many of these limitations became obsolete. Video games were toys first and foremost in the minds of both consumers and developers at this time, so scripted narratives would remain very simplistic for the vast majority of games during this formative period. But over the next couple decades, there would be several watershed moments that pushed storytelling in video games to new heights, specifically by creating unique experiences that invoked the interactivity of video games alongside a scripted narrative. Among the first and most impactful of these was Chrono Trigger, which featured a time-traveling narrative that was made to feel more impactful and immersive through the introduction of multiple endings that flexibly reacted to the player's actions, and the New Game Plus system that opened up further endings due to the character's stats and levels carrying over. It allowed the player's choices and the game's mechanics to dictate the path of the scripted narrative, and it did so at a scale that hadn't been seen before, not even in the JRPG genre, which was leading the industry in terms of scripted storytelling. Then, the emergence of 3D rendering would create a heightened sense of immersion, replacing abstract blobs of pixels that represented characters into visuals that could mimic reality much more closely. The opportunity this brought to create more so cinematic experiences was seized by Metal Gear Solid, which would prove to be an incredibly successful and influential game that also implicated the player directly in its narrative through their willingness to interact with the game. Later on, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus would combine the cinematic techniques made possible by technological innovation while mostly shying away from direct storytelling through text or voiceover, instead putting the player's interactions with the world and the characters at the forefront of the experience and allowing the story to be created through that. These games helped greatly to push the potential for interactive storytelling forward, but the AAA industry would eventually gravitate towards cinematic games where gameplay and story would only intersect at a basic level. Standout pieces of interactive storytelling like Spec Ops: The Line and The Last of Us would continue to be created by large studios, but in terms of innovating on the potential of mixing gameplay and narrative, the emergence of indie development would drive much of that going forward. Indie games like Braid, Gone Home, Journey, One Shot, Outer Wilds, and many others would show the potential for low-budget, oftentimes relatively short games to create narrative experiences that simply didn't exist up to this point. They all utilize interactivity in unique ways because they weren't weighed down by the need to be commercially viable in the eyes of a AAA publisher, allowing that sort of experimentation to flow and arrive at new and powerful possibilities that interactivity can provide. In the realm of storytelling and independent game development, there's one developer that stands out above the rest in terms of just how influential his games turned out to be, as well as how consistently excellent their narratives were. This developer is, of course, Davey Wreden. If you recognize that name for anything, it's almost certainly as the creator of the Stanley Parable and maybe The Beginner's Guide, but you might be surprised at how deep both the backstory behind those most influential releases goes, alongside the more obscure games that his name is attached to. Davey's own relationship to his work, as well as his relationship to the success of that work and his willingness to discuss these relationships openly, makes for one of the most fascinating stories of any single game developer I've ever seen. Alongside that history, I'll be giving some commentary on the design of these games and just how they managed to be so successful commercially and artistically, and why they continue to influence the indie scene today. This is the story of Davey Wreden, indie gaming's most prolific storyteller. The story of Davey Wreden's career as a game developer begins in 2009, but it's important to set the stage of what the landscape of indie games looked like at this time before getting to his story specifically. Although foundational freeware indie titles like Cave Story were several years old at this point, the world of commercially viable indie games was just starting to grow from its infancy in 2009. In particular, platforms like Xbox Live Arcade were offering a space for smaller and cheaper titles which could feasibly be built by smaller teams, with games like Braid proving that indie developers could create successful products that were also quite unique and successful artistically through these new online distribution methods. The only thing that was missing at this time was an easy, relatively inexpensive way for a developer to make the jump from hobbyist development to a fully published game. Working with Microsoft to publish games on Xbox Live Arcade was expensive, even when ignoring the costs associated with purchasing dev kits to work directly on the hardware, and on the PC gaming side, Steam would remain a relatively closed ecosystem for the next few years, as Valve would only allow trusted developers to publish on their storefront. Even aside from this, working with the limited tools available at the time was cumbersome for most prospective developers, especially those without a background in computer science. 2009 was a time before Unity or Unreal became the titans of streamlined game development we know today, making the prospect of getting into game development seem fruitless to those without a technical background. Braid was among the first games to be a success in this ecosystem because Jonathan Blow was and still is a senior software engineer who was willing to spend upwards of a decade working on low-level software and a developer with an excellent mind for puzzle design. But for those more solely interested in design or other creative aspects of game development, this was a huge barrier for entry. Even for freeware development, this reality would stop many hopeful developers before they could even make a prototype, though the lower bar for overall quality in freeware games meant it was much easier to get into. But in the realm of PC gaming specifically, the act of modding existing games was an age-old practice, popularized by the classic id Software FPS games like Doom and Quake, which were among the first games to be built as easily moddable platforms. Though these map packs and mods wouldn't be viable as fully commercial products for several years due to their reliance on existing copyrighted games, their pre-existing code, assets, and level editors allowed for quick prototyping and experimentation without necessarily touching any code in many cases. The id Software games were already popular for this in the early to mid-90s, but the Gold Source and Source engines created by Valve as heavily modified versions of the Quake engine would provide more possibilities than ever. Valve embraced the culture of modding even beyond their willingness to release modding utilities, as they hired many Quake mappers and mod developers in their early years, including the entire team responsible for the original Team Fortress Quake mod. Since modding was such an important part of Valve's origins, they supported the practice by releasing the Gold Source SDK following Half-Life's release, a software development kit that gave modders much greater flexibility in how they could change the engine's inner workings to create more than just custom maps. With a full SDK, total conversion mods were made much more feasible, which were mods that stripped out much of the original game's mechanics and assets in favor of customized logic and unique art styles that suited the mod's specific goals. The same thing would happen for the Source engine following the release of Half-Life 2, which was even more popular thanks to Source's sophisticated physics engine and expanded graphical capabilities, providing much more out-of-the-box value for those without a computer science background. Valve's willingness to allow and even encourage mod development on top of the Source engine is what brings us to Davey Wreden. In 2009, Davey was a college student attending the University of Southern California, originally as a film student but later moving to pursue a degree in critical studies. USC had a notable interactive media program at this time, but Davey decided not to pursue a degree through that program despite his stated interest in becoming a game developer. Instead, he decided to create a Half-Life 2 mod using the Source SDK as his first foray into game development. Rather than using this toolset to leverage the Source engine's physics engine or visual capabilities, Davey wanted to make a game with intensely simplistic gameplay, instead choosing to focus almost solely on the game's narrative elements, and the eventual result was one of the most popular and influential Half-Life 2 total conversion mods ever, the Stanley Parable. The inspiration for the Stanley Parable was found in Davey Wreden's lifelong enjoyment of video games. Although he grew up with Nintendo games, as he grew older he began to gravitate towards more mature, story-driven experiences, including games like Metal Gear Solid, BioShock, Braid, Half-Life 2, and Portal, as well as some existing story-driven source mods like Dear Esther and Radiator. These games all took their own unique approaches to scripted storytelling in an interactive medium, but they're all relatively linear, heavily scripted stories outside of the occasional alternate endings. Their scripted nature makes whatever sort of choice they offer ultimately illusory, as the player can't actually act outside of the script in any way that will impact the story. As Davey played these games, that was the question he began to ask himself: what would happen if you could act outside of a game's script? This is the question that the Stanley Parable was designed to explore, and it's a question that inherently centers around choice. In the mod, the story of a man named Stanley is told by an omnipresent narrator, but although the narrator speaks authoritatively on what Stanley does, the mod offers branching paths where the player is allowed to disobey at certain moments. Davey claims that the narrator was part of his original concept for the mod, with the player's ability to disobey representing that ability for the player to go off script in an intuitive and satisfying way. Each of these branching paths eventually ends with an ending, with a total of 6 possible endings found in the mod. Unlike the branching endings found in other games, which essentially exist in parallel timelines, the endings in the Stanley Parable feel disconnected from each other on a more physical level, but Davey's stated intention for the mod was to create a set of endings that are more so connected thematically in a way where the endings depend on each other for meaning. The result is a deliberately jumbled continuity and a story that isn't so much about the events in that story as it is the ideas communicated through that story. After arriving at this basic concept, Davey would spend about 2 months writing and planning the entire mod before touching any of the necessary engine work. He had no experience actually working with Source going in, but he knew that it was well suited to creating simple corridors thanks to its use of brush-based geometry and binary space partitioning, both features dating all the way back to Quake. Alongside the ease of creation that the Source SDK provides and the available assets from Half-Life 2 for a non-commercial mod, these were Davey's main motivators for using Source. Although most of what Davey planned during the writing phase would make it into the mod, he does admit that there were a handful of things that didn't work out for technical reasons. One of these features that didn't work out is the keyboard input checking found in the Red Door ending, which gives the player fake button prompts that don't actually react to input. While Davey planned for these prompts to actually await the player's input, either the limitations of the Source SDK or his own inexperience prevented him from achieving that, though it did end up making some thematic sense in this context for the player's input to be ignored. Although Davey was able to make much of the Stanley Parable as a solo developer, there was one other collaborator that would be a very important part of the mod, the voice of the narrator. Kevin Wreden is the now iconic voice of the Stanley Parable's narrator, and he was found by Davey through a voice casting site called voice123.com. Once he heard a sample of Kevin's voice, Davey immediately knew his deep British accent was the perfect fit for the narrator. When Davey sent Kevin the script he had written, Kevin recorded the entire script in one consecutive 30-minute take, which is the exact dialogue heard in the release version. Davey would later go on to credit Kevin's voice as the narrator for much of the mod's success, and it's not hard to see why. It's about as perfect a casting as you could expect for a mod of this size and budget, and it helped tremendously to bring the narrator to life in a way that also compensated for other areas where the mod felt amateurish. Although the Stanley Parable's development began in 2009, the mod wouldn't release until 2011, despite the writing process taking just 2 months. Davey Wreden was a college student for nearly all of the mod's development, and this combined with his lack of technical experience made for a lengthy development cycle considering the scope of the game. You can easily see everything that the Stanley Parable has to offer in under an hour, but if you can design a game that's this tightly packed with story content that explores such interesting questions, it doesn't really matter how short the game is. When the Stanley Parable released on ModDB on July 31st, 2011, the mod's page received some traction typical of a new mod at the time, but it quickly spread through word of mouth to a very important person in the world of indie game development at the time, Notch, the creator of Minecraft. When Notch made a tweet about the Stanley Parable, the mod instantly exploded in popularity. Mainstream gaming news publications were writing articles about the mod, less players picked it up and spread the word of its release to their viewers, and just like that, the Stanley Parable was downloaded about 70,000 times in its first week, and Davey Wreden got a perfect start to his game development career. He wasn't expecting this response, as he had already made plans following his graduation to move to Australia to help run a video game-themed bar, but now there was only one path forward in his mind. Now, it should be stated that the Stanley Parable was not perfect by any stretch. Although it got by quite well on the novelty of its ideas at the time, it's clear that corners were cut in places, as you would expect from a free mod of this size. For example, the music found in the mod is not original, as the game includes music by artists like Frank Sinatra and bands like Nine Inch Nails and Radiohead. This obviously wouldn't fly for Davey in the future when creating commercial products, but it got the job done for a free mod on a platform with less stringent copyright enforcement. Additionally, for as iconic as Kevin Brighting's voice as the narrator is, the quality of the one-take recording session is spotty in places, with the sore thumb being the inconsistent mastering for the lines during the self-destruct sequence. Compared to Kevin's later roles, his performance here is significantly more monotone and low energy in general, though this flaw is only truly noticeable in hindsight. But most importantly, the Stanley Parable was a Half-Life 2 mod that awkwardly uses many assets from that original game. And even aside from this, the mod is quite barren in terms of visuals and decoration to make these hallways less monotonous to walk through. On top of this are all the technical features that Davey didn't manage to implement in time for the mod's release, which all makes for a somewhat awkward experience in the modern day despite the mod's cutting-edge narrative style. But, as you probably already know, Davey wasn't done with Stanley just yet. Davey Wreden was aware of the shortcomings of his mod and the potential left in the Stanley Parable's concept, which is why he announced just a few days after the mod's release that he wanted to remake it as a standalone game, and he put out a call for anyone who would assist with this endeavor. It's unclear how many people answered this call, but the most important of those was William Pugh. William had a notable history within the wider Source Engine and Valve community, as his mapping work earned him a Saxy in 2011, which were the annual fan-voted Source Filmmaker Awards for Team Fortress 2. He heard about the Stanley Parable from Notch's tweet, and when he saw that Davey was looking for collaborators, he reached out with this level design concept. Davey and William quickly found that they meshed very well creatively, as William would be able to handle level design while also bringing new writing ideas to the table. Development of the Stanley Parable HD Remix, as it was called during this stage of development, began by faithfully recreating the mod's existing endings beat for beat, just with a new coat of paint. This was Davey's initial plan for this standalone version, but his discussions with William would eventually lead the HD Remix to become expanded in terms of content as well. Since both Davey and William had essentially all of their game development experience in Source, that's the engine they decided to use for this new project, which was a bit of a gamble at this early point. Davey explicitly said in an interview within months of starting on the HD Remix project that they were still working out legal details around licensing the Source engine, getting the game on Steam, and even using Valve's own assets in the game. Valve has had a long history of licensing their engines to other developers and supporting mod developers in general, so it wasn't a huge gamble, and it was still a very minor worry for now. Davey even claimed they were planning to release the game under a Bandcamp-esque pay-what-you-want model, which did have potential to make the legal discussions go smoother since it technically wouldn't be a directly commercial product. But Valve was happy to license the engine to Davey and his team, and that was very important because the most serious flaw of the original mod was its visual quality, which would have been much harder to fix if they were starting from scratch in terms of assets. On some level, the wide, oddly tall empty halls and sparse decoration of the original mod fit the sort of unease and loneliness the game wanted to convey, but the reuse of Half-Life 2's assets stuck out like a sore thumb in what was ostensibly meant to be an office building. The aesthetic of a bland yet detailed and cluttered office environment was decided on for the remake, which is a design decision that works on many levels. It makes far more sense for Stanley's boring desk job to exist in this setting. It still plays to the Source Engine's strengths in terms of level construction and rendering optimization, and the banality of the setting creates a juxtaposition with its own emptiness that can only be described as liminal. But I'll touch on that a bit more later. Music was also a concern when coming from the original mod, and unlike most indie productions, this game would feature the talents of 3 different composers. Blake Robinson composed the more upbeat, almost whimsical pieces heard in the game's intro and other places scattered around its various endings. Yannis Ioannidis contributed all the music heard in the Mind Control Facility's endings, which demanded a darker tone with more synthesized instrumentation. Christian Backer would mostly handle the music heard in the game's trailers, alongside some tracks for the Insane ending. Considering the game's dissonant narrative threads that vary widely in tone, it's not surprising that consulting multiple composers was seen as important as a way to play to each of their strengths, and the result is a remarkably memorable set of tracks despite much of the game playing out without any music accompanying it. Thanks to the licensing of the Source Engine and the help of additional team members like programmer Jesus Higueras, the technical limitations of both the Source SDK and Davey Wreden's own technical abilities were overcome, and that led to much more interesting storytelling possibilities as well. Arbitrary keyboard input blocking the continued narration in the phone ending was solved, which was made particularly powerful by the narrator's insistence that the player not push the button, conflicting with the player's interest in experiencing the entire game and hearing all the narration. Davey wasn't able to get this working in the original mod, but it opened up a very compelling exploration of this intersection of interactivity and scripted narrative for the remake. The way that the game seamlessly restarts after each ending, with minor or major differences to the opening hallways randomly appearing, was another technological step above the original mod. The seamless restarting improves pacing and plays into the idea that the end is never the end that the game promotes, while the changes found between restarts helps with that sense of liminal space that the game's static aesthetics already promote quite well. But this is all just the behind-the-scenes development process that could be gleaned from materials following the game's release. At the time, the development of this standalone remake was much more secretive, as revealing even small bits of it would work to spoil the game's many fun surprises. Davey was open that the game was being developed through a WordPress blog called the Stanley Parable blog he opened after the original mod's release, but no more specifics on the standalone version were given for over a year after that release. Alongside blogs about random topics, Davey would tease another game he had begun to conceptualize on August 31st, 2011, which he called Project 2 as a placeholder title. The only real glimpse the public ever got of Project 2 was a grainy photo of a paper version of the game that Davey tested with a friend, a playtest which didn't go over very well according to this blog post. It would later be cancelled in April of 2012, since Davey didn't feel like the game was living up to his expectations for it. Compared to the immediate hook he felt when starting to work on Stanley, Project 2 didn't have that spark. This WordPress blog would continue up until March of 2012, which is when Davey would reveal and launch the website for his new development studio alongside William and the rest of the team, Galactic Cafe. In this first post, Davey would also reveal the existence of a new project, the Stanley Parable Mobile Edition, an iOS game made in collaboration with a mobile development studio called Lonely Pixel Productions that was slated for a 2012 release. The art released alongside this announcement was very different from the art later seen in the standalone release, and that's because Davey had little to do with this game aside from revising the original mod script to poke fun at mobile games instead of PC games. Lonely Pixel Productions had no finished work to their name when they approached Davey, but he decided to allow them to work with the IP and retain the privilege to veto the game's development if he didn't like their output. He eventually realized that he was going to attach his name to a game he didn't really care about in the same way he cared about the standalone PC version, and the team at Lonely Pixel seemed to have similar levels of enthusiasm for the project after nearly a year of development, so Davey would announce the cancellation of the mobile edition on August 5th, 2012. It was also in mid-2012 that Davey launched the marketing campaign for the remake, beginning with a teaser trailer on May 31st, 2012. It gave the narrator a darker, more threatening presence, while also playing into the kayfabe that the game is being developed solely by him. This kayfabe would continue with the infamous Raphael trailer on July 29th, which is easily the most notable of the trailers for the game. It took a more comedic tone by using a real email received by the team, poking fun at its sense of self-importance and confusing arguments by attempting to create a hypothetical game that would meet those impossible expectations. It's funny, it shows the Stanley Parable's fourth wall-breaking appeal and meta-commentary, and it even briefly explores an interesting idea through the impossible video game presented. The Raphael Parable is a fake video game where you can do literally anything, which is practically the antithesis of the Stanley Parable's heavily scripted nature. The illusion of being able to go off script is at the core of the Stanley Parable, but this trailer presents an impossible game with legitimately limitless possibilities and no script, which is such an interesting juxtaposition to the paradox that is the actual game's script. Shortly after this trailer's release, the HD remix was approaching a major milestone, which was the submission to Steam Greenlight, the system by which Valve offered unknown developers the opportunity to publish on Steam prior to Steam Direct. Within Greenlight, every submitted game was allowed a description, some images, and a trailer to show users, and those users would vote on whether or not the game should be greenlit. Valve would then take the highest voted games and allow them to publish on Steam, which was a major step up for indie developers when compared to their previous policy of handpicking trusted developers. The Stanley Parable was submitted shortly after the Greenlight system launched, and it eventually became one of the first 30 games to be greenlit by Valve on October 16, 2012. This Greenlight page included several screenshots that were quite confusing and nebulous to the uninitiated, but it had its own appeal in some sense, which combined with the popularity of the original mod to easily launch the remake's Steam page. Steam Greenlight as a program was indicative of a shifting landscape for indie game development, and a lot had changed since Davey had started developing the Stanley Parable mod in 2009. The early 2010s was the beginning of the indie boom, led by developers like Jonathan Blow, Edmund McMillan, Derek Yu, and Terry Cavanaugh. These more prolific indie developers were being handpicked by Valve to be allowed onto Steam, but they also had the opportunity to work with Microsoft to publish on Xbox Live Arcade, which was an expensive but also quite popular marketplace for indie games. There were also indie games like Minecraft, soaring to incredible levels of popularity despite their existence outside of these traditional distribution platforms, further proving the potential interest in these lower-budget, independently developed titles. Now, starting with Steam Greenlight, there were fewer financial barriers than ever to getting a commercial game into the hands of customers, which was arguably the true starting point of the indie boom. The Stanley Parable was already known in indie circles for the mod's inventive narrative style, and this put Davey Wreden and the rest of Galactic Cafe in the perfect position to capitalize on this surge of interest in indie games, assuming that the Stanley Parable would be successful and would release in a reasonable time frame, of course. In order to help ensure that success, the marketing campaign for the Stanley Parable continued over the next year in the lead up to its 2013 release window. A series of blog posts on the Galactic Cafe website called the Stanley Parable Helpful Development Showcase began in February of 2013, which were essentially mock devlogs that occasionally showed tiny peeks at the game's visuals surrounded by comedic writing. A couple of these showcases were simply unedited chats between Davey Wreden and William Pugh, which are quite the time capsule in terms of how wonderfully unprofessional and low production value they are.
And you'll always be on your toes wondering whether or not you'll receive a paycheck from me when the game comes out.
It's a good point. I do need to sign my fucking contract.
So
you gave me that like 3 months ago. I've got to sign that.
See, look, more personal issues coming out here. Your inability to follow through on your legal obligations.
Even the most basic thing that I've got to do.
You just
to
had
ensure...
to put a signature on it, and you'd be guaranteed some amount of money. Like literally, you just had to sign a paper and make money on work you've already done.
One second.
Are you gonna do it now?
Really no, I'm not.
No, do it right now while they're listeing.
Oh, fucking...
Sign it. Sign your contract, William.
One second. I'm trying to find it. I'm trying to find it. Fucking...
I can resend it to you if you do you need it.
No, I want to find out how long I've left this.
The game also received 2 additional teaser trailers, and while the trailer uploaded as an announcement of the Steam Greenlight campaign fit in with the confusing tone of the Greenlight page itself, the trailer uploaded just a month before the game's launch in September of 2013 was much more interesting. It featured the voice of a Let's Player named Chilled Chaos, expressing his confusion at the impossible, labyrinthine halls of the bizarrely expansive office environment, which was the first time the public got any prolonged look at that liminal aspect of the remake. It also pinpointed what would eventually be a significant contributor to the game's cultural relevance post-release: Let's Players. The original mod was already an experience that could easily excel as content for Let's Players, a short but sweet narrative experience that elicited interesting and varied reactions, and playing into that quality for this trailer was a very smart move. The final cherry on top of the Stanley Parable's marketing campaign was the demo released on Steam alongside the full game's release, which is only really contested by Metal Gear Solid 2's pre-release demo as the greatest video game demo ever made. The Stanley Parable demo isn't just a single slice of the complete game, it's an entirely unique 20 to 30 minute game filled with new gags and its own unique commentary. It effectively markets the quality of the full game's writing and its confusing yet meaningful contradictions, all while not revealing anything about the full game's story. It's so different from the full game that it's worth playing even if you've already played the full game, which is a mark that the vast majority of demos do not reach, and this was a very important part of Davey's marketing strategy. Not showing any significant part of the full game in the demo or trailers meant that the surprises of the full game would remain untainted by that marketing, with the entertainment and spectacle of the marketing itself making up for the fact that they weren't directly selling the game. But now, with all the marketing out of the way, all that was left to do was to release the game, with the Stanley Parable arriving to Steam on October 17th, 2013. Davey and William had set a sales goal going into this release, which was the number of copies they would have to sell in order to finance the next game made by the studio, and the Stanley Parable reached that goal in the first 24 hours of its release, even reaching over 100,000 copies sold within its first 3 days. Reviews from major gaming publications were glowing, praising the game's unique approach to storytelling and the thought-provoking content of that narrative, with many reviews encouraging prospective players to not read any reviews before getting the chance to experience the game. The game quickly gained traction at award ceremonies, being nominated for several awards at IGF 2014, including the Seamus McNally Grand Prize, with it even winning the Audience Award at the ceremony. The BAFTA Video Game Awards nominated the Stanley Parable for Best Story, Debut Game, and Game Innovation, with Kevin Brighting also receiving a nomination for his performance as the narrator. Various publications would even put the game in their running for Game of the Year at the end of 2013, cementing its place as a landmark release for this formative period in indie development. But more than just being celebrated by the games industry, the Stanley Parable broke into the mainstream in a way that the vast majority of indie games simply hadn't up to this point. The sheer quality of the game as content for Let's Plays didn't go unnoticed, as some of the largest gaming channels like PewDiePie and Markiplier would push the game out to millions of viewers. With this popularity, the game managed to break out of the world of video games and into certain, seemingly unrelated sections of popular culture as well. The most notable of these instances from the time of the game's release was its cameo in an episode of House of Cards, which is unfortunately a less than ideal association in the modern day, but at the time it was one of the most popular actively airing shows that used the appearance of a few select indie games to reflect the psychology of its characters. Additionally, as a testament to the game's memorability and longevity, the Stanley Parable was also cited as an inspiration for Severance, the 2022 TV series which aired nearly a decade after the game's release, and over a decade since the mods. And I can't help going through the impact that the Stanley Parable had on pop culture without mentioning that Davey and William were far, far ahead of the curve by capitalizing on the appeal of liminal spaces. Remember that the original 4chan post that launched the Backrooms into being the internet horror phenomenon we know today was made in 2019, but the Stanley Parable was able to intelligently employ that uncanny emptiness to strengthen its story and ideas, rather than using it solely to build tension in a horror setting. It simultaneously fit the game's comedic tone and its darker, more unsettling tone flawlessly, with the office's various strange inefficiencies being fun visual gags, while simultaneously being off-putting in the oddly empty halls of an environment that feels like it should be bustling with activity. But what the Stanley Parable was right on time for was a major rise in interest for interactive storytelling, spearheaded in the AAA industry by games like The Last of Us, but in the indie scene by various smaller games that earned the somewhat derisive title of walking simulator. Games like Dear Esther, the original story-driven source mod turned commercial product, were an inspiration for Davey when creating the original Stanley Parable mod, and other indie developers would follow in these footsteps and create experiences that emphasized a tightly paced narrative over game mechanics or challenge. Most of the notable early indie games like Cave Story, VVVVVV, or Super Meat Boy were made as callbacks to the simple joy of retro gaming, but games like Dear Esther, Gone Home, Proteus, and of course the Stanley Parable provided a different sort of experience that indie games could now achieve even with limited budgets and smaller teams. They found a hole in the market for non-gameplay driven experiences and interesting narratives that the AAA industry would likely never truly fill, and that made the Stanley Parable specifically an incredibly successful game. It stood out among its peers for being funny and witty in a way that other walking simulators simply weren't, and that made it more palatable to a general audience when compared to Dear Esther's long-winded melancholic prose or Proteus's complete rejection of traditional narrative or mechanical structure. Within a year of its release, the Stanley Parable had sold over 1 million copies, and the futures of Davey, William, and the rest of Galactic Cafe seemed secure. They were set up to become an important, trailblazing studio in indie development, showing the power of seemingly simple experiences wrapped in clever writing and innovative uses of interactivity. But instead, the Stanley Parable would be the first and only commercial product that would be produced under the Galactic Cafe name, and that release would be another event that shifted the course of Davey Wreden's life, this time for the worse. So I have to admit here that I've been lying by omission a little bit throughout this video. While we've been following the public success story of Davey Wreden, the prolific indie storyteller and star of the 2010s indie boom up to this point, a different side of Davey began to emerge following the Stanley Parable's release, and it would lead directly into the release of his next commercial game. But before getting to that game, we need to start back at the beginning of our timeline, oddly enough by jumping ahead. On April 13th, 2015, Davey Wreden gave a talk at Aalto University in Finland for a lecture series called Games Now. While Davey was ostensibly invited to talk about game design, he decided to make his talk about the motivation we have to create any sort of art, which he discussed by going over his own struggle with his own motivation. During this talk, Davey reveals another part of his motivation for creating the original Stanley Parable mod that he didn't reveal in interviews around the mod's initial release, which was a feeling of loneliness.
Why did I make that game? Why did I spend 2 years killing myself over that mod? Well, there's no simple answer to that. For one thing, one big piece is that I really wanted to get a job at Valve, which for those who don't know is a very large game development company. And I was hoping that this game would make for a good resume piece. But is that the only reason? I know that a few of you have played Stanley Parable, so of course you know, but for those who don't, that it's about a man who discovers that he's all alone, everything that he thought would be there for him has left, he's given no choice but to wander the empty halls of his office alone, searching aimlessly, given no solace but the voice in his own head. So again, why did I make Stanley Parable? It's because I was alone. I felt very, very alone. And it's not like I didn't have friends, I had great friends. And yet the burning thing on my mind was the story of this man who's completely, vastly alone. It wasn't enough just to have friends. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be liked for some much grander reason. I wanted to be told that I was great. I wanted to overhear a conversation on the bus. Hey, Davey Wreden's got a new game out. What a genius. What a paragon of brilliant narrative design. I wanted to be made complete through the validation of someone else.
Davey's motivation for creating the Stanley Parable was to receive exactly the type of immediate, incredible praise it would miraculously end up receiving. Although this was enough to feed that motivation for a while, he would quickly pursue more by beginning development on the remake alongside William Pugh. After just over 2 years of development, the Stanley Parable would release to widespread acclaim and massive financial success for an independent production. This is exactly what Davey wanted, to receive that praise from not just the thousands that voiced their interest in the original mod, but from the tens and hundreds of thousands that would eventually play the remake. Since Davey was the sole developer of the original mod, and he owned and controlled the email address attached to the game for anyone who wanted to get in touch, he was perfectly set up to bask in that attention, but he quickly found that this attention was no cure for that desire.
But the problem is that validation is not a vaccine. You don't just take it once and then the disease goes away. You have to keep taking it, like hunger. It returns every single day. You cannot sate the desire to be praised. In fact, the very opposite. The more you feed it, the stronger it grows. I was going into this launch trying to get something that you actually cannot get, to be 100% validated by others. I responded to all of them. I responded to every single email. I assembled paperwork and art assets for festivals that wanted to show the game. I got on calls with every person who asked to do an interview. I wrote long email responses to every person who sent me written interview questions. I sent out a dozen copies of the game for review every single day. I accepted every opportunity to travel somewhere to give a talk. I got on phone calls with every publisher who wanted to chat. I responded to every single email that people wrote me, every single one, every email where they told me about their experiences with the game, told me about their lives and what they'd been thinking about lately and what was scaring them and about the games that they were trying to make and their own ideas and their careers and their hopes and asking for advice and friendship and comfort, and I responded to every single one of those emails. Hundreds of them in a few days or weeks or however long it was. This was my life. I didn't do other things. I pretty much just responded to emails.
Despite Davey's exhaustion with responding to organizers, journalists, news publications, and even just random people, this is what he had wanted for years, and that need for external validation drove him to depression.
I was driving myself into the ground trying to respond to absolutely every piece of communication that came my way. And it wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't like this had just come out of nowhere. I had been setting myself up for this for years. The intention, one of the big reasons that I'd been making games, was to be liked. I had defined that goal so strongly and so monolithically that there was no room for other things like, self-care or mental health. No, be liked, be praised, make connections, talk to people. There was no limit to it. This won't end. Just be liked, forever, infinitely. That's the rest of your life. Spend all of your energy, every ounce of strength that you have. It's all worth it. This was my why. This was the purpose that drove me.
The Stanley Parable had a controversy just a week after its release that is largely forgotten today, which involved 2 slides in a slideshow found in the game that some considered racially insensitive. Davey agreed with this assessment and prepared an update to the game that softened the tone of these slides somewhat, but because of this, whereas most of the communication he was receiving up to this point was positive, for the next week he received mostly hate mail about this self-censorship.
And then you get dozens and dozens of these emails, and suddenly all you see when you close your eyes is anger and hatred and the belief that someone else, someone you've never met, is wrong. I had to. I didn't have a choice. The defining motivation was to be recognized by all people. And remember, I was already at the absolute end of my energy. By this point, I was 100% drained by all the communications and emails and interviews and stuff. So now this next big thing happens, and it takes me down to less than nothing. I had less than nothing to give. I felt like less than a person. So here's what happens when you have less than no energy. Normally, I'm someone who enjoys socializing, being around good friends, and making regular communications with people in my life. Suddenly, in the weeks after launch, I disconnected myself from everyone. I didn't even realize I was doing it. The way that it occurred to me at the time was that suddenly, all at once, everyone was intentionally trying to piss me off. I remember once I was sitting at a table in our living room, and one of my roommates came up and put a cup down on the table, and I had felt that the table ought to be my personal space. And I remember he put the cup down, and the thought that went through my head, I became furious, and I'm thinking to him, how could you? You really hate me. You really want me to be miserable, don't you? That's the mentality that I was in. I had less than no energy for anyone in my life. So even the remotest intrusion into my personal space equated to a complete and total assault on my very being. I was shutting myself down in order to protect myself, in order to try to get myself away from the onslaught of opinion and feelings that I had allowed myself to be subjected to. It was a defense mechanism against myself.
This onslaught of opinion and feelings naturally died down over time, but then the end of 2013 and beginning of 2014 came around, and gaming publications began to publish their Game of the Year awards for 2013. Given that the Stanley Parable was widely praised by critics, it would appear in many Game of the Year lists going into 2014, and this brought another surge of publicity to the game and to Davey Wreden. Given all that had happened before with that publicity at launch, he wasn't ready to handle it, but he did it anyway because this praise is what he had been after this whole time. This led to what is now the most infamous and public piece of this period in Davey's life, the Galactic Cafe blog post titled Game of the Year. Davey explained his depressive struggle following the Stanley Parable's release for the first time publicly, and the additional toxic validation he received from all those mentions in Game of the Year lists. Although he was concerned that outside observers would view this as typical crying into a pile of money sympathy bait, the comments under the blog post and elsewhere were generally understanding of his perspective, and even understanding of the short comic he drew expressing these frustrations that would be even easier to paint as sympathy bait.
I would obsess over every single award and nomination. I would read each of them frantically, looking for Stanley Parable. Every single other game on the list was totally meaningless to me. And honestly, Stanley Parable was pretty meaningless to me too. I would barely even read the little quotes that they'd include alongside the nomination or the award or whatever. All that I was here to do was just to make sure that we're on the list. I didn't even get that much joy from seeing it on the list. It's like a drug where eventually you're just taking it to not feel awful, you know? And of course, being addicted to something just to keep yourself from feeling awful is itself a profoundly awful experience. And again, you might say to yourself, but Davey, why don't you just not read Game of the Year awards? And again, the answer to this very simple sounding question is because it's what I had wanted from the beginning. From the beginning, I wanted to be recognized in shows and festivals. I wanted news outlets to talk about me and my work. I had assumed that all of it was good. And so when I started getting it, it did not occur to me that I might stop reading them. So let me reiterate that. It literally did not occur to me that I might not read award nominations, turn down interviews, ignore emails. It was straight up not a part of the world that I was living in. This is the power of your intention. Your intention will dictate the things that you think are and are not possible. When what you want most is recognition and not, say, mental health, it will not occur to you to turn down recognition, even though it is literally causing you to withdraw from the world in depression. When I was younger, I always kind of laughed at the idea of being addicted to something. You know, like cigarettes, right? It just seemed ridiculous. If you want to, if you don't want to smoke cigarettes, then just throw them out. Or, like just don't go and buy cigarettes, right? How hard could that be? But in being addicted to praise for my work, I learned in a very real and very brutal way that you physically do not have a choice. You've surrendered your decision-making power to something else that you signed a contract with years ago. A contract which declared with authority that praise and connecting with people are the most important things above all else. You really thought that at the time.
This idea of a contract is central to Davey's talk. It's the thing that overrides your other decision-making processes to prioritize its own fulfillment, to decide above all else what is most important, all because you've decided before that this is what you desire.
Everyone has this, whether you know it or not. You are developing and refining this reason every single day and with every single thing that you create. This is the contract that I mentioned earlier. This is the internal voice that has decided what is the most important thing. That whenever you come to a big decision, your internal contract will always privilege this one thing above all others. To you, it doesn't even occur to you as a contract. It just occurs to you as the truth. It's possible that you might not even realize that your other people's contracts are different than yours. But everyone has this reason. And the unfortunate reality is that for almost everyone, the contract tends to make decisions from a place of fear. Fear that you'll never be enough, fear that you will never have enough, fear that you will never be truly, truly loved, fear that you will never fit in. And whenever the voice of fear gets what it wants, it goes stronger and hotter, and it becomes more sure of itself. And when it grows big enough and powerful enough, it will eat you alive. Because you'll no longer be making decisions for yourself. The only decisions that you will be able to make are those that serve the needs and fit the guidelines of the contract.
One particularly important incident that Davey mentions from this time period was when his roommate decided to tell him how he truly felt about living together in the months since the game had released.
Robin, who's my roommate and one of my best friends, I started treating him really badly. I felt like everything that he did that he was trying to do to hurt me personally. I thought of him as lazy and sloppy and irresponsible, and I would tell him that. I would point out his character flaws to him, like suggest ways that he might be more likable. Now keep in mind, Robin and I were best friends for over a year before this. We live and work together. He did the sound design on Stanley Parable. He was and is one of the closest people in my life, which is perhaps why I unleashed my anxieties on him. And then that summer, almost a year ago, or a little under a year ago, he pulled me aside one day and sat me down and told me that when he was around me, when I was in the same room, that it made him feel physically ill. And that's when I realized, for the very first time, what a shitbag I was being. I didn't realize up until this point how out of hand it had gotten, how really awful I was being to myself. It took 9 months since the game came out.
Davey reiterates a few times over this talk that he had gone to therapy and is now happier than he ever was after mending many of these relationships. But this did not save Galactic Cafe from its fate. The Game of the Year blog post was the last post Davey would make on the Galactic Cafe blog for over 2 years, and he and William Pugh would amicably agree to stop working with each other for the foreseeable future. William would quickly pursue further game development prospects, starting his new development studio Crows 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 and releasing Dr. Langaskov, the Tiger, and the Terribly Cursed Emerald, a Whirlwind Heist, in December of 2015, alongside several other experimental games over the coming years. Davey would need some time away from the spotlight for a while in order to work through the issues he was facing, but in the same way that the Stanley Parable featured an autobiographical element and how its loneliness reflected Davey's loneliness at the time, he would soon return to release a similarly autobiographical look at his struggles with motivation and praise. The Beginner's Guide. The Beginner's Guide released without significant fanfare, being announced just 2 days before its release on October 1st, 2015. It features Davey Wreden as a character within the game's story, and the games of a fictional character named Coda. Davey walks the player through these short, experimental games while providing his interpretations of their various quirks through the lens of someone who knew their creator. But what's revealed by the end of the game is Davey's meddling in Coda's work, and his insistence to break down Coda's boundaries by showing his games to others without his permission. It essentially starts as an exhibit of interactive art led by a tour guide who knew the artist, before morphing into a psychological profile on the tour guide that ends with an emotional breakdown. Of course, this is a fictional narrative about a fictional game developer for whom Davey created games for, but it's an intensely autobiographical game in terms of what Davey struggled with after the release of the Stanley Parable. Davey Wreden created the Beginner's Guide almost entirely on his own, but he did enlist the help of 2 musicians to handle the game's audio. Ryan Roth was the primary composer who created unique songs for each of Coda's games, with Helena Herron contributing songwriting and vocal work to a couple tracks. The result is a soundtrack that flawlessly fits each and every one of these odd artsy experiments, hitting the important emotional beats and tastefully complementing Davey's narration. While Ryan was similar to Davey in his silence following the game's release, he did give a peek behind the scenes at his own personal process through a scan of the physical notes he took while composing and designing the sound for the game, which was bundled with the soundtrack's release on Bandcamp. These notes are the most the public ever got of the behind-the-scenes development of the Beginner's Guide, as Davey refused interviews with the press to allow the game to speak for itself. But aside from audio, the Beginner's Guide was entirely the work of Davey Wreden, and it's the ultimate paradoxical psychological autobiography of his depressive mental state following the Stanley Parable's launch. Davey's narration describes Coda as an odd guy who makes these weird art games for no one to see but himself. He's essentially the platonic ideal of an artist, creating for the sake of creation and playing with new ideas without regard for how they may be seen by others. But Davey was the opposite when the Stanley Parable released. He was driven by how his brilliant ideas would be praised by others, and within the game's story, he pushes against Coda's disregard for basic aspects of commercially viable games like playability, leading to him inserting the lampposts and various other tweaks into Coda's untainted vision. He wants to make these really interesting experiments into games that are easy to love, as a vector for people to praise him. But Coda would argue that sometimes art shouldn't be easily loved in that way. Although Davey stated that he wouldn't be doing any interviews about the Beginner's Guide for obvious reasons given his previous struggles with that sense of availability, those struggles clearly set the stage for the tension between Davey and Coda's motivations for their creative energy. Coda's final message to Davey even contains a direct allusion to his roommate's quote where he told Davey being around him made him feel physically ill, which is about as explicit a connection as you can make to Davey's personal life in this situation. But that paradox comes in with another important theme found in the Beginner's Guide, which is the death of the author. Throughout the game, Davey constantly talks about Coda's games as if they reflect some part of their creator, a sentiment which is rejected by Coda in his final message. It leads Davey to realize in the epilogue that there isn't necessarily any connection between Coda and his interest in building prisons in his games, because maybe he just likes making prisons. The idea that there is an authoritative reading to Coda's games, or any piece of media that relates directly back to the author's personal struggles, is rejected here, but it's in a game that is so clearly molded by the author's struggles, which feels impossible to ignore once you know of that backstory. It's somewhat uncomfortable to talk about the Beginner's Guide with respect to these real-world events, since it seems like Davey doesn't want his own motivations for making the game to influence how the audience interprets the game's text, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to think of Davey's experience as additional context on top of a game rich in interpretation. The Beginner's Guide is full of these sorts of paradoxes and contradictions. It presents itself as a live tour of a series of art games, despite being a scripted narrative that reveals itself as such by the end. It preaches the worth of creativity without any regard for external perspectives, while existing as a commercial product that is quite comfortable gameplay-wise for anyone to play and enjoy. It shows Davey's interpretations of Coda's games as misguided at best and directly harmful at worst, but it invites the player to make those same sorts of interpretations of its text. It's a fascinating game to think about, to wrestle with its totality and find meaning in that mess of conflicting signals, and that's what makes it one of the greatest games of all time in my eyes. But ultimately, that depth and narrative has a fairly niche appeal in the broader landscape of video games, and that's reflected by both the game's review score on Steam and its reviews by news outlets. The Beginner's Guide is a very different experience in terms of narrative and tone when compared to the Stanley Parable, and those who went into the game looking for more Stanley would inevitably be put off by the more serious tone of the writing and its more emotional moments. It's also just a game that won't appeal to most people interested in engaging gameplay, so although it's much more positively reviewed on Steam recently, it still sits at 88% positive reviews overall. Critics were also more conflicted, with a few reviews calling the narration pretentious and its ideas haphazardly forced together into a dissonant package, and others essentially calling it Davey Wreden's sophomore slump following the breakout success of the Stanley Parable, though it was reviewed quite positively on the whole. But in all likelihood, this didn't really matter to Davey, and not just because he was keeping himself from indulging in that spotlight. To take a metaphor from the beginner's guide, the entire game feels like an exercise of reaching deep within himself and wrestling with a topic that he finds difficult, then closing the door on that part of his life and moving on. After the beginner's guide, Davey was unsure of whether or not he would ever be able to write another game again after these 6 or so years of non-stop work. But of course, his story as a game developer doesn't end here. Although you may have been familiar with Davey Wreden's commercial releases going into this video, you may not be aware that he's released many small freeware games over the years. While the bulk of these games would arrive after the beginner's guide's release, we do have to step back in the timeline once again to see the beginning of these experiments. In 2012, right in the middle of developing the Stanley Parable's HD remake, Davey participated in the 23rd Ludum Dare Game Jam with a game titled Life in the West. Rather than being some sort of spaghetti western like the name would imply, this is a game where you play as Kanye West, making posts on Twitter. It's an incredibly simple experience that has some fun jokes here and there, though in the modern day it's much more interesting as a time capsule, both for the early years of Twitter as a website and for a time when Kanye West's eccentricities were seen as cute and entertaining rather than just sad. For a game made over just a few days, it's still a fun way to spend a few minutes, and it landed Davey in 5th place in the Jam's humor category. The other free game that Davey released during the Stanley Parable's development was called Pleasurable You, which he made in the branching narrative engine Twine and released through the Galactic Cafe blog on January 9th, 2013. Twine is much too limited a tool for any significant commercial use, but it works quite well for little experiments like this, and for people like Davey who wanted to avoid coding as much as possible. Away from the eyes of the general audience on his relatively obscure blog, Davey released this game and described it as extremely uncomfortable for me to play, and even more uncomfortable for me to share. It's a very brief, barely interactive story about sex, where you select different sex acts that refer to your sexual partner as it, eventually ending with wildly swinging feelings of conflict and the declaration that you are normal. When put into context with all of Davey's other games, Pleasurable You is probably the strangest in terms of the sensitivity of the subject matter it tackles without any hint of comedy, but that's what's so interesting about these little freeware games. They can get away with being bizarre and uncomfortable and stupidly simple, but they can still communicate something to those willing to push past that barrier of awkwardness. But in October of 2013, the Stanley Parable released, and this brought Davey's productivity with respect to game development to a halt as he devoted more energy than he could realistically give to receiving praise and accolades. Then he would devote his time to developing the beginner's guide, and once that released, he was unsure if he would ever write for or work on another full commercial game again. Of course, this wouldn't end up being the case in the long run, but Davey would release many freeware games in the interim alongside Ryan Roth, the composer for the beginner's guide, on ryansitch.io page. I won't go over all of these exhaustively, though there are some standout releases here that definitely should be mentioned. The most widely publicized of these games was Absolutely a True Crime Story, which received some media attention since it was one of the first things Davey Wreden had released following the beginner's guide. It released over a year after the beginner's guide on November 27, 2017, and it's an RPG Maker game that follows Keanu Reeves stabbing random people and dealing drugs to children. It's covered in stock RPG Maker assets, the player character doesn't look anything like Keanu Reeves, and the design of every NPC is completely incongruent with the game's setting. Trying to ascribe some deep meaning to the game itself is a waste of time, but in the context of Davey's career up to this point, it does feel like a reflection of his exhaustion following years of non-stop work. The sheer nonsensical stupidity and simplicity of the game is practically the opposite of Davey's commercial games, which were the products of years of dedication and meticulous planning to ensure nothing felt unfinished or out of place. To many developers and artists in general, releasing something that you didn't put that kind of effort into is terrifying, but in the context of a freeware release, it doesn't feel so out of place, and those quirks or flaws are both forgivable and sometimes even additive to the experience. This itch.io page is also home to various other RPG Maker games of a similar caliber, but most of them are a little more interesting in the context of their creation. Davey Wreden and Ryan Roth would consistently attend MagFest each year, and each year they would hold an event called a Narrative Jam, where they created a game in RPG Maker with input from the audience within the span of 1 hour. These games are even more nonsensical and incoherent than the Keanu Reeves game, but playing them after the fact isn't really the point. For these games, it's more about the journey than the destination, with both the silly ideas coming from the crowd and the incredibly tight time restrictions making for a much more enjoyable process to be involved in, rather than an end product that's enjoyable in itself. It's more comparable to performance art than a traditional video game, and they're at least interesting in that context, more so than the sum of their final parts. The final standout game found here is Neo City Express, a game made for Ludum Dare 53 in May of 2023. Davey worked alongside Ryan again for this, but also with Pedro Medeiros and Isadora Rodopoulos to create a very impressive game jam game given the 72-hour time limit. Neo City Express is a simple arcade runner game that forces you to multitask while avoiding traffic, including tasks like texting or taking drugs to avoid swerving the car, which complicates that typical arcade gameplay significantly. Davey was responsible for the game's writing, which is very similar to his other freeware experiments in terms of the drug use themes and oddly positive dialogue despite the game's darker undertones. Since the gameplay is still quite simple, even with the forced multitasking, the humorous writing elevates the experience significantly, with a lot of fun gags like the stupidly long text message on the first day being enhanced by the mechanical context they're placed in. That symbiosis between the writing and gameplay led to Neo City Express being the #1 overall rated game for Ludum Dare 53. Davey Wreden's freeware games are not especially fascinating in and of themselves, though they do show a different side of him when compared to his polished commercial releases. It's a more unapologetically amateurish side that just wants to throw ideas out into the world without regard for how they'll be perceived by others or how much attention he'll receive for them, and that does show plenty of growth when compared to his mentality going into the Stanley Parables release. But regardless of whether or not making these tiny experiments was a therapeutic experience for Davey, or if it was just a convenient creative outlet, he didn't permanently step away from active commercial game development following the beginner's guide, as he would eventually be contacted by William Pugh with an interesting idea that would have the two of them return to the game that made their careers. On December 6, 2018, the annual Game Awards were held by Jeff Keighley, and it was easily the Game Awards with the most independent representation that had been seen up to that point. This representation ranged from Celeste's Game of the Year nomination to Return of the Obra Dinn winning Best Art Direction over a slew of AAA games, and even many notable future indie releases being announced at this show, like Hades from Supergiant Games. But early on in the show, there was a surprise announcement of an indie game that is actually pertinent to this video. The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe was advertised as another remake of the Stanley Parable, modernized for release on consoles and with some extra content thrown in. Although this initial trailer heavily foreshadowed what that new content would entail, it didn't give much more to go off, fitting in with the deliberately vague marketing of the 2013 version. The really important thing was that the game was being developed by Crows, William Pugh's development studio he formed following Galactic Cafe's disbanding. Davey Wreden was writing all the new content for the game, and of course, Kevin Brighting would take up the role of the narrator for the third time. What's funny about this trailer in hindsight is the projected release window of 2019, because Ultra Deluxe ended up having a much longer development cycle than the team initially expected. By the end of 2019, it had been delayed to 2020. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic caused productivity to slow, delaying the game to 2021. Then, by the end of 2021, the release was narrowed to early 2022, before finally being announced for release on April 27th, or 427. However, it would be inaccurate to call the game's development troubled in the same way that other famous cases of development hell were, because progress on the game was relatively smooth over those 3.5 years, and development never had to totally or even partially restart in order to reach the game we know today. Instead, Davey Wreden claims that scope creep was the cause for all the delays, on top of the pandemic slowing everyone down, of course. The new content found in Ultra Deluxe was originally much more limited in scope, but just like how Davey and William gradually expanded the scope of the original game as they thought of fun new ideas, Ultra Deluxe would expand as the team realized the potential of their existing concepts. In particular, Davey states that the bucket was originally only going to change the narrator's dialogue for each ending, but once they played around with the idea of creating unique set pieces centered around the bucket, the scope of the game expanded dramatically. Ultimately, the script for the new content ballooned into being longer than the original game's entire script as a result, and that's what caused the game's protracted development cycle. When Ultra Deluxe released, the vast majority of the new content wasn't really connected to the original game's content, whether that be in terms of contiguous space or in terms of the original's ideas and themes. Instead, this game is essentially a critical examination of its own concept, an expanded remake of a game that already said all it needed to say and is remembered fondly as a landmark of its genre. The narrator creates the Stanley Parable 2 within the game as a cash grab for investors, with the bucket existing to remove the original's flagship contradictions and replace them with shallow comedy covered up by pretty set dressing. This wasn't a mistake, as Davey would state in an AMA that he thought about what he could write to capture the same tone and ideas as the original game, but he came up with nothing and instead decided to pursue a much more comedic writing style for the new content. So rather than viewing Ultra Deluxe as a true follow-up to the Stanley Parable, it's better to view it like the sophomore album of a musical artist who hit it big with their very first project, with this new project being shaped by how that success changed its creator. Although the Beginner's Guide is a better fit for this in some regards, given how it explores Davey's struggles following the Stanley Parable's release, Ultra Deluxe much more directly interrogates the success and legacy of its predecessor through that direct association with it. The narrator blatantly reminisces on the positivity around the original game's release, before being baited by negative Steam reviews into creating a sequel full of shallow fan service and tonally dissonant humor. By the end of the game, a stand-in for the developers allows you to create an infinite number of pointless sequels to the Stanley Parable, alongside the declaration that the original game's legacy doesn't matter. To editorialize a little bit here, looking at Ultra Deluxe through this lens has led to my opinion on the game softening over the last few years. Within a month of Ultra Deluxe's release, I made a video essay that generally expressed disappointment and a bit of frustration that this remake didn't expand on the original game's more interesting ideas. A lot of the bucket's humor didn't really land for me as well as it evidently did for others, and that made the whole game feel like it was intentionally lazy, though that's arguably the whole point of the game. The bucket is shallow compared to the depth found in the original content, but that's because it's in the context of a fake sequel that's designed for, in the narrator's own words, long-term franchising potential. It gets so metatextual that it's easy to get wrapped up in the spectacle of how much effort was put into jokes and gags that really aren't that funny, but it's charming in the same way that someone putting way too much effort into a silly meme is charming. Davey's explanation for why he took this route with the writing is something I suspected was the case before I did my research for this video, and the mythos of the Stanley Parable's brutalized fourth wall is an ideal backdrop to make a game poking fun at unnecessary re-releases, so it's understandable why Ultra Deluxe came out this way. As much as I was hoping over those years since the Game Awards announcement trailer that Ultra Deluxe would expand the Stanley Parable's existing ideas, this was definitely a case of me letting my expectations grow out of control. And as much as I was disappointed in the moment when I played the game, it did the one thing I always really hope for when I consume any sort of media. It demanded that I think about its text long after it was over. So while it's easily my least favorite of Davey Wreden's commercial games, it still sits among them as a truly interesting game that demanded my attention, and it's one that I still think about sometimes to this day. But for the general audience, the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe was arguably met with a warmer reception when compared to the original game, with the game sitting at a more positive overall review score on Steam when compared to its source material. Davey Wreden was quite happy with this reception and the popularity of the game, but for the entirety of Ultra Deluxe's development, it was actually more of a side project for him that he would write in his free time away from his day job, with most of the serious development priorities being handled by William Pugh and the rest of Crows. Most of Davey's energy was being put towards a new passion project for him, which was embroiled in an even longer and much more secretive development cycle that would result in his longest and most complex game to date. But to get to that game, we need to step back in the timeline one last time. Coming out of the strenuous and painful development of the Beginner's Guide into the new year of 2016, Davey Wreden needed to take some time away from it all. Thanks to the success of the Stanley Parable alone, he had the financial security to take some time off, relax, and consider if he would even want to continue writing for video games. So rather than writing, he began to draw. He began drawing for hours, nearly every day, and all these drawings converged around a central theme, a cozy tea shop surrounded by a serene natural landscape. After such a tumultuous period in his life, he hoped that he might find drawing this calming scene as a way to calm himself. Whether or not it did truly calm him, this is where Davey found inspiration for his next big passion project, Wanderstop. Based around his drawings, Davey wanted to make a cozy game, which was a genre that was just starting to be revitalized by independent developers. Stardew Valley had just released in February of 2016, which would bring a lot of demand for independent cozy management games over the coming years, but Davey's personal interest in the genre had begun with Animal Crossing. Just before the Stanley Parable's release, he had released a blog post criticizing the then newest installment in the franchise, New Leaf, for its failure to break from the series' formula of endless chores, and how those chores get in the way of the experience he would like to have with the game. Wanderstop would be his answer to those frustrations with the Animal Crossing formula, as he envisioned a game that was much more a product of design than writing, with the earliest prototype being a much more open-ended sandbox than the writing-intensive exercises that were his previous games. He planned for procedural generation and modular story beats to combine and allow the player a sense of true relaxation, though when he showed this prototype to others for playtesting, he described the feedback he received as muted. This is where Davey's primary collaborator for Wanderstop would arrive to help Davey find the voice this game needed. Carla Zamonja is most well known for co-creating Gone Home and Tacoma alongside the Fulbright Company, and she had known Davey for a while following his rise in the indie scene. She joined Davey in creating Wanderstop following the failed prototype, and began to act as Davey's editor. They worked together to find an interesting story to tell around the concept of the tea shop, which eventually centered around the character of Alta. She was a silent protagonist in the initial prototype born of Davey's reluctance to write at the time, but Carla would help develop her into a fully fleshed out character. Much like Davey's previous games, this is where the story became somewhat autobiographical, as he said that he decided to make Alta everything about him that he thought needed healing. Alta's obsession with fighting and remaining undefeated would lead to painful defeats, and she would continue totally unaware of how much she was hurting herself by refusing to stop and rest, much like how Davey was unaware of how much constant commercial game development and the fame that came along with it was hurting him until he collapsed from exhaustion. With this new direction, Davey and Carla would form their new studio, Ivy Road, and begin work on Wanderstop in earnest. But as usual for his commercial projects, Davey would need to onboard a composer to work on the game, and he would be in the right place at the right time to collaborate with the creator of the most popular indie game soundtrack ever, Daniel Rosenfeld, aka C418. Daniel is most well known for the 2-album soundtrack to Minecraft, and he was looking to develop a game in 2015 that was centered around an album he would create. This exact plan never came to fruition, of course, but his willingness to collaborate with established game developers on this project led to him joining Ivy Road and producing another 2-album soundtrack for Wanderstop. The resulting albums comprise one of the best video game soundtracks in recent memory, and I would highly recommend listening to it even if Wanderstop itself doesn't interest you. But even aside from its writing and music, Wanderstop is the most complex commercial game that Davey's name has ever been attached to, particularly in terms of gameplay. His name is still most widely associated with the walking simulator because the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide are both extremely light in mechanical depth, as they instead choose to strip down the traditional first-person shooter control scheme into its essential locomotive parts. The breadth of interaction that Wanderstop's management systems demanded would be far beyond anything he had worked with before, and it proved enough of a challenge that other concepts for the game would need to be scrapped for being far too ambitious. For instance, the procedural generation concept from the game's original prototype was tested, with the garden around the tea shop expanding procedurally as a reflection of the player's growth. But the technical aspects of this concept proved more troublesome than it was worth, so this concept was scrapped in favor of entirely handcrafted environments. The added complexity of Wanderstop demanded more talent to make the game truly come to life, which mainly came in the form of 3D artists. Temi Olujobi was hired as the game's art director and environment designer, who was responsible for refining Davey's existing concepts into a vibrant art style. The styling of vegetation found in the game makes them feel almost painted into the world using a brush, drawing from impressionist paintings that emphasized visible brushstrokes as a part of their style, which was also reflected in the game's 2D art seen in cutscenes and dialogue sequences. The game's cast of characters were brought to life by a variety of animators led by Aura Triolo, who used the game's lengthy development cycle to pour a lot of effort into tiny details of the animations. Systems like item grabbing and holding are much more complex than they look on the surface, and her blog posts go into a lot of detail on the game's procedural animation systems that contribute significantly to the game's overall feel. Along the way, Ivy Road partnered with Annapurna Interactive, a publisher known for their embrace of indie studios creating focused, high-quality experiences that often involved a focus on narrative. This was announced in the 2021 Annapurna Interactive Showcase, where Davey, Carla, and Daniel appeared together to announce their studio and partnership with Annapurna while teasing their game's theme of tea. Then, after several years of silence, WonderStop's world premiere was shown at Summer Game Fest 2024, over 8 years after Davey sketched the tea shop for the first time in 2016. With the game's development starting in earnest in 2018, this means WonderStop took 7 years to create, which isn't too surprising given the game's scope and the refinement of its final presentation, combined with the small team responsible for it all. It takes over 10 hours to play through on average, and although the entire game takes place in slightly varied but still quite similar clearings, each chapter is filled with new ideas and characters and scenery that demanded more development time. It seemingly just took a long time to get that all to the mirror-shine polish that the team was after, but once they finally deemed the game complete, WonderStop released on March 11th, 2025. The game was very well received upon its release, but unfortunately it was also Davey Wreden's least successful commercial game. Whether it was due to the waning of interest in this sort of cozy management game, or just a lack of standout marketing for the game, WonderStop released to much quieter fanfare when compared to either of the Stanley Parable games or the Beginner's Guide, despite reviews from critics and consumers being quite positive on the whole. Ivy Road had begun to work on a new project they called Engine Angel, but the lack of sales from WonderStop and a lack of investors to fund their new project meant they couldn't sustain development, especially not another 7 years of it. So instead, Ivy Road would shut down on March 31st, 2026. But following WonderStop's release, Davey wasn't even sure he would be involved with Ivy Road's future. Instead, he planned to take some time away from game development with the financial security from his previous projects. But as I said before, it probably doesn't matter to Davey how well WonderStop performed financially or how positive those reviews were, as he's evidently grown out of that mindset after it caused him so much pain following the Stanley Parable's release. So for the time being, this is the end of Davey's story. I suspect he'll return to commercial game development in some form eventually, and I eagerly await that day because Davey Wreden has been one of the most consistently excellent game directors ever. It's partially my bias talking, since I love his writing approach of building his narratives around the ideas and themes he wants to communicate, but I consider the Beginner's Guide especially to be an essentially perfect game, a flawless experience where every single choice made and idea presented contributes meaningfully to the narrative and the game's overall experience. The Stanley Parable is also a game I consider practically flawless, and it's probably the game that influenced me the most to seek out and play these oddball indie games and eventually make YouTube videos about those games. But more than this just being my opinion, Davey Wreden's early work was part of an important trend in video games in the early to mid 2010s, which was the indie scene's exploration of designs that are almost solely driven by narrative. Games like Gone Home, Proteus, Dear Esther, and of course the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide all released within this period of several years, and they all showed the potential for video games to explore designs that weren't built around mechanical challenge or depth. These sorts of games aren't really made by large studios even today, and that's why I find these games and their developers so important, because that variety can bring out some truly exceptional games that wouldn't exist without this independent ecosystem. I've found that these almost solely story-driven experiences have fallen out of favor in recent times, so I find it important to highlight how important they were in building the indie scene into what we know today. Davey Wreden has been one of the most influential game developers on my life, my work, and how I want to tell stories in the future, but also on independent game development in general and the art of interactive storytelling, and that's why I wanted to make this documentary and celebrate all the passion and dedication that he put into his games. I'll be disappointed to some extent if he never returns with something new to show us, but I'm still confident that I'll be thinking about Davey and his work for a long time.